Okay, so this is basically your draw structure, which you're familiar with. It's the same as your one, Ralph, the one you're working on for LTL. I know this is not focused around LTL, but it's just a draw I had available. It's got your documents in it, so I've used it. So if we go back to the dashboard, so I've created a number of pin searches around different statuses. And I've got one here that shows me all invoices. So there's a number of statuses here, and if one of these is for coding, it's showing I've got 10 invoices that are waiting to be coded. So I go to all invoices. This gives you an idea of
Hey Ralph, are you having a hard time hearing Tim?
I am. He started fading.
Oh, okay. Let's see if we can find out how to turn that up a bit.
Now you're good again.
Am I? Okay, I'll leave it there. If you can hear me, I'll leave the mic where it is. It's almost down the side of my throat. So if you look at the status column here, you'll see there's a whole bunch here at non-PO coding, and there's 2 set for duplicates. What I'm going to do is just, for the demo, I've got a way of resetting these, and this is not part of the standard functionality. This is just my way of resetting the things to a known beginning state for the demo. So if I save that now, you'll notice they all disappear. So all the statuses are empty. In the background, there's a service that runs that says, are there any new documents? Oh yes, what are they? Let's try and match them with something. Let's see what needs to happen to them. And all of that's a configurable workflow. And if I refresh the list now, you'll see all the statuses have come back because they've all been processed. And it says, oh, actually, these 2 are duplicates, meaning I've already got an invoice from that company with that invoice number on it, etc. And I can add date range validation on that. So if it's an invoice within a certain date time frame for the same supplier with the same invoice number, it's considered duplicate. It can also do PO matching. So if these are invoices with purchase orders and we've got information about a purchase order, it will try and compare the invoice with the purchase order, and it will compare things like quantities ordered and price, unit price. And if we've got receipt data, so if this was like a stock situation where we were buying stock to go in a warehouse, if we've got receipt data from an ERP system, we can also compare the invoice with the receipt data. So we can check that the invoice is for the right quantity that we ordered at the right price that we ordered, and we've actually received the goods. And so we can do logic that says, actually, everything's good, this is all good to pay, or actually something's wrong and someone needs to look at it. For non-PO invoices, which is what I've configured here, we can do one of 2 things. We can either read all the line items at the time of capture in OCC, which you're familiar with, Ralph, or we can ignore the line items in OCC and define them in the AP workflow here. We can also populate them based on rules. So if we know when we get an invoice from a particular supplier, it's always going to be coded the same way. So maybe we always have 3 lines, one for cost center A, one for cost center B, one for cost center C. We can pre-code those and then decide who's going to approve them.
Hey, Tim, have you changed your screen, or is it still just on that basic screen with the non-PO and the duplicate? Okay.
It's on the same screen, non-PO.
Okay.
Yep.
Hey, Ralph, are you hearing a lot of feedback?
I'm hearing a lot of, like, white noise or something.
Yeah, me too.
Is that you, or is that, because I know I'm muting when I'm not talking.
Me too.
Could be me. I'm not hearing anything other than myself.
This is better now.
All right.
Shall I carry on?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'm just reading my notes here. And so the way I've configured the workflow here, if we look at the admin module, I've based this around groups, except I need to log in as administrator. I'm not reading my own notes. Sorry about that. So ignore that, it's just my auto logging tool. So if I look at the groups that we've got defined, I've got a group for AP clerks, so I can decide who are the people that are going to allocate invoices, code invoices, etc. I've got a group of approvers, so these are the people that can approve invoices, so I've just got a bunch of different approvers defined. And then I've got different cost centers set up, so I've got cost center A, cost center B, cost center C. Obviously you can have different ones, and you can decide which users reside within each, or have authority within each cost center. So all of the sort of high-level logic about who can do what is just defined and managed at group level, so that can be sort of configured within Document Manager by yourself. And then I've got different sign-off limits, so I've created a group that can sign off 100K and 10K and a million. So that just sets the scene, which we'll sort of explain a little bit later on when I do stuff, why it's gone the way it's gone. So if I go back to my dashboard, let's go back as, actually I can stay in here.
Hey Tim, there's still a little bit of, I don't know, like feedback. It kind of sounds like someone's tapping on like a microphone. Ralph, are you hearing that too?
It's probably because the microphone's so close to my mouth, which I put it there because you guys couldn't hear me.
Oh.
Go ahead and move it away a little bit.
Hang on, let me just try and adjust the gain on the microphone, maybe. Figure out where that is. Oh, here we go. Move it away and turn it up. Is that any better? Can you still hear me?
So far, yeah.
Yep, we can hear you and no popping.
How about
Perfect.
now? I'll leave it
Even
there.
better.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's perfect there.
Cool. Right.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll go back to my list of invoices. And I'll pick one and just find which is a good example to pick. Hold on. Belmont Petroleum. So if we open one of these invoices, so the invoice will open and you'll see here the two line items. At the bottom we've got basically the captured totals, so these are the sort of, if you like, header footer values of the invoice, so the total amount payable, the net and the tax. This is what came in from OCC or whatever else you've used for scanning the documents in. The invoice totals in the bottom right, these are the totals of the line items. And so to basically push an invoice for approval, it has to be coded correctly, and these totals have to match, otherwise you won't be able to push it into the next stage of a workflow. And to code an invoice, basically we have to expand the line item and code the details. Now we can configure these, which fields are displayed here can be configured, and we can change the layout of the fields. That's all definable. And we're not doing purchase order number validation here, but we could be, and if we were, we could basically go and browse our list of purchase orders and add a purchase order line to that, or if we were doing goods receipt matching, we could browse to a goods receipt and pick that. But let's ignore that. Let's just go for basic department cost center and GL coding. So if I click on the department for a line, I can pick which department, and that list can come from your finance or ERP system. And once I've picked a department, I get to pick a cost center, A, B, or C. You'll notice if I change the department to Department 2, then my cost center list is different, so they can be interdependent. And again, all of that is just pulled from the finance system. So I'm going to select cost center A, and then I get to code it. So the list of GL codes, again, okay, these aren't GL codes. Well, they are codes, but they're just random bits of text that I've used as descriptions. But so you can pick the for GL codes, and again, the GL codes are imported from the finance system, and they can be filtered by cost center and department. So you can stop users picking invalid codes for the various things they're trying to pick.
So if we've got like a 7-part GL number, I mean, and I don't know if they've sent any examples. We may have to get creative with some of these. That's question one, because I know we're using Microsoft Dynamics, and I know they have some other things, and I don't know if they're as complex for the invoices that they want to code. The second question I've got is, if I have a couple of things, if I have a recurring invoice that codes the same way every month, am I able to code the rules?
Yes, you can basically add, so you've got this load a template option here.
Right.
So if I load the template, I can do one of two things. I can pick from a pre-hard configured template. So we always know we've got 10 line items, and it's always these codes and departments, etc. Or I can browse recent invoices from the same supplier and copy the coding from one of them. So,
all right, that makes sense. And then on the breakout, because I know a lot of times they take one line item. Let's say it is a cellular phone bill for $50,000.
Yeah.
And then they break that up into a lot of different departments.
Yeah. You'd have a line for each department, basically.
Okay. All right.
So if you had 50,000, you'd have 10,000 for Department A, 10,000 Department B, 30,000 Department C, and so on.
So even though the invoice may be imported with one line item, like this 15,877 here, I can code that to multiple line items?
You can do as many as you like. So I just happen to have two here. I can add another row if I want to. So I can add, if I go and code my fuel line now, so I'll say that's also Department 100, cost center B. That's a different cost center and a different GL code. If I want to now, I can add another row. And I'll call this.
Okay, but what I'm getting at is if I have that 15,000 and it's supposed to be broke up into 3 lines of 5,000 equal amounts to 3 different departments, I have to manually split it.
Yes, but if you knew you were always splitting your phone bill between, say, 4 departments,
right?
What we can do is define a template that says Department A always pays 10%, Department B always pays 30%, Department C always pays 25%, etc.
Okay.
And so it will auto calculate the ratio of the split. So you can be simplified if you pick from a skeleton. We call it a skeleton. If you pick from a skeleton, most skeletons can be defined either without values or with percentage values, in which case they'll take, you know, whatever percentage of the total invoice for each line.
Okay. So and with that skeleton, it'll create the extra lines we need over here to do the GL coding. Okay. Because that's going to be the main thing.
Yeah. So if there is a skeleton defined for a supplier, then you would read the invoice in OCC with just the header, footer information and the total. When it comes into Document Manager, that initial process, the thing that sets all those initial statuses, that will say, hey, there's a skeleton for this supplier, let's apply the skeleton, and you'd open it here, and there'd be 5 line items, all with the values filled in, with the cost centers, departments, GL codes filled in. And then the only thing you need to do as the AP person is decide if you want to mess around with those values, you know, if you want to change it from the defaults to something else maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. Right, let me just scroll down my instructions. Okay. Now, once it's validated, I could tick the box and it would approve. Let's say I'd miscoded something. So I will actually add a row. So let's put a dummy row on. Item code Ralph. Call it Ralph Tax. And we'll give it an amount of 500. So now I've got another row of 500, so my totals don't balance. So let's say we had coded that, and then we were going to try and push this for approval. If I tick the green tick box to push it onto the next stage, it says it can't be exported because the the totals don't match. And the totals don't match because they definitely shouldn't do, because I added one. So if I take that away, then the totals will match. I can approve the invoice. And I know it says sent for export, but what that actually means is the invoice has been checked and it's now ready to be allocated to someone for approval. If I look at the document indexes in Document Manager, you notice the status has now changed. Where it was AP coding, if I go back here, it was non-PO coding. And now it's set to allocate. I've also got these other fields here, approver and approval CC. So that's actually who's approved the invoice and which cost centres are going to need to approve it. So now we move into the realms of allocating cost centres. Now I've done this as a manual thing. If there were hard and fast rules, we could say, for example, always add for a particular vendor, it's always cost centres 1 and 2 or so on. But for now, I've just done this as a manual thing, and I've used out-of-the-box Document Manager workflow to do this bit. So if I go to the workflow button, I can now add cost centres that need to approve this invoice. So I'm going to add cost centre A. And if I go back to the menu, you see my menu's now changed because I've added cost centre A. I don't have that option anymore, but I'll just take it away. But I'm going to add cost centre B. And then I'm going to send it for approval.
You're fading again.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what else I can do now.
All right, that's fine.
So I've now sent it for approval. So if I look at my document indexes now, you'll notice the status is now set to pending approval. And my approval cost centres are A and B. So it's saying this needs to be approved by cost centres A and B.
So again, in that first step, when you were doing your allocation, or I guess allocating, or your GL distribution, whatever you want to call that, and you save it and send it to the next step, you're saying we do have the ability to predefine the approvers and predefine the rows where somebody doesn't have to manually do what we just did, right? We just got to set it up to do it that way.
If you know what those rules are, yes.
Okay. All right.
I'll show you how I've defined the workflow in a little bit, but just so you can see what's going on behind the scenes, it's now changed the document status to pending approval, and it's showing me here that the approval cost centers are cost center A and B, and there are no more workflow actions available on this document because as PeakLoc, I've done everything that I need to do.
All right. So then now you got to log out and log in as one A or B to approve it.
Exactly that. So I'm going to log out of here as whoever I was, and log in as one of the approvers. Approver 1. Password. So, unfortunately, my there we go. Come on. So there's now one cost center A invoice pending approval. So I'd look at that, and the strange thing is I can't approve it. I can reject it, and the reason for that is that I logged in as approver 1, who is in cost center 1, but the invoice value is higher than my sign-off limit. So I can only sign off up to 10,000 because I'm a first level approver. So this needs to be approved by someone bigger than me. But the way I've configured the workflow is I'm allowing this user to do the reject, because it could be that someone junior can make the decision that we're not going to pay this, but only someone more senior can make the decision to actually pay something. So I'll log out and I'll log in as someone who can approve it.
So in this case, like if I have that, right, and I don't have the authority to approve it,
yeah.
Do I have the authority to reject it? Or I can't do anything with it?
You could do here. So it gave me the option to reject.
Okay. I just didn't know if if they reject it, then it's not going to be there for the next approver, but that's fine.
If they reject it, no, then it's going to go somewhere else in the workflow. And where it goes is entirely up to you, because you're going to define the workflow or tell us how you want it defined. So if we come back and refresh, so I'm still a member of Cost Center A. I'm now approver 2. There's my invoice to be approved. And if I look at the workflow menu, I've now got the option to approve it. Okay?
All right.
So if I approve that now, it's now no longer in my list of things to approve. This was my saved search. And that,
So, can I ask another question also, though? So as this, because I see it all shows up on that person's dashboard, is there anything built in so that as things change status that they can get a email notification or anything else that they have stuff out on their dashboard, or do they just have to monitor the dashboard?
so there's 2 things they can do. They can either just monitor the dashboard, or they can use the alerter pop-up, so they can have a little pop-up tool in the system tray on their desktop, on their Windows desktop, and that will run periodically and say, hey, you've got 5 invoices you need to look at. The other thing we can do is automate an email summary, either once a day or twice a day. Similar to, I think we've done something with automated email reports for the LTL project, haven't we? But we could do the same sort of thing for this if you wanted to. So generally, we would send an email to all the users who have got something to approve, saying, hey, you need to log in and approve your invoices, and you've got 5 invoices to approve. The other thing we can do is send an email to the AP team and say, these are all the invoices out for approval. So it lists all the invoices that each user has to approve and how old they are, so you can trace them up. And all those alerter searches, they're just saved searches. So that one here, for example, is just a search saying, show me all of those pending approval, Cost Center A, and it was as simple as that.
Okay.
If I log out now and log in as another approver, so we log in as, I've got to get which one is right, 1, 2, 3, 4, approver 5, no, 5, which is what I want. Because it's got to be someone with an adequate sign-off. Sorry about that annoying prompt.
Nope, I'm used to it. I use that same software.
Okay. It does interfere with our pinned search refresh, though. It doesn't refresh the counts while that dialogue's there. So there's my invoice. If I look at this now, you will see that on the document indexes, the status has stayed as pending approval, even though the last guy approved it. But you'll see approver 2's name has been added to the approver list, and A has been removed from the approval cost center. So now it knows it's just cost center B that needs to approve it. So let's approve it for cost center B. So that's now gone from my list. And if we log out and log back in as one of the AP team.
So I have the ability to set up approvals. If it's being split across 5 cost centers, I can either say all 5 have to approve it, or I can set it up where just one person can approve it on behalf of all 5. Okay, all right.
Yeah. So now you see I've got 9 for coding, and I've got 1 approved. So if I click on my approved one, we should see now that the status is now set to approved. And actually, I should have put a space or a comma in there, but we've got approver 2 and approver 5 of the guys that have approved it. Of course, we've still got the audit trail, so I didn't have to do that. I just did that for visual effects, but this will show me basically who's done what. So pending approval became approved. Yeah. Approver 2 became approver 2 and approver 5. Yeah. We removed B from the list of cost centers and so on. So it's a full audit for the whole approval process there. And then finally, the person in finance can mark that for payment, and that's typically when we would do the data export to the finance system to say, here's an invoice, it's all been approved, you need to pay it. And then that would come back into the document manager system as a record once it had been paid, to update the status to paid. So that's a very simple model. And I'm just going to show you the workflow designer around how we built all that approval process. So this is our graphical workflow editor. Have you seen this before, Ralph?
I have not.
Okay, so here we can create workflows by basically dragging a stage on here, giving it a name, putting some conditions on, so we can say what are the conditions of this stage. We could say, well, this stage is when the status is equal to exported, for example. And we can have more and more conditions, and then we can say, well, where can we go from here? Well, we can do an action, so we can take a step from this stage and do some stuff. So we can do all these things with the document. We can call out to external systems, send an email, print it, etc. And then ultimately end up at another stage. So what I've done is use that to create this. So the AP clerks here can, let's say, so they can add cost center A to an invoice, or they can remove cost center A. If we just look at the conditions here, so we're saying for this to happen, the user has to be in the group AP clerks, and the invoice status has to be to allocate. And then if they're going to allocate, so we're going to allocate add cost center A, so the approval cost centers mustn't already have an A in it, which stops that reappearing. The remove, of course, the cost center has to be equal to A. And what we're doing is updating the indexes. We can change something for approval. So it's all about conditions and who can do what. Yeah.
So in this thing, because you said is some of the things you can actually update or do things external to Document Manager?
So the sorts of things we can do here, we can run a client-side application. So we can invoke something to run on the client side, or we can invoke an app to run on the server side. We can open a URL, or actually make a call out to a web service. So if you've got a sort of web API type interface for your finance system, where we can just pass some parameters on a URL and it will do something, we could say release this for payments, for example, if we use a transaction number, those sorts of things.
Okay. And then, have you guys written, or do you know if it exists something that, because I'm assuming we'll have all the data we need to create the invoice in Dynamics, because we're approving it, and by approving it, then we want to go create that invoice in Dynamics so that they can pay it. Right?
Yeah. So that's all that data at line item level. So in the same way that we're exporting the data for Continuum, we've got all that data that you saw on the user interface, all the line item coding, cost center departments, etc., all the values, all of that would be passed out to Dynamics to go and create the invoice.
Okay.
If we look at the logic here, the conditions, this is where we were saying who can approve for each cost center. So I'm here saying that if the invoice total is less than or equal to 100,000, and the user is in the group, sign off 100K, or the value is this and it's less than 1,000 and so on. So this is where I can determine who can sign off. So I decide my groups here, and then it's just a case of putting the right people in the right groups in Document Manager.
So what is that? So I do have a question there. So I'm looking at this guy, right? And 1 million guys should be able to sign off on all three. 100,000 should do 2, and the 10K just the first one, right?
It's well, if
okay.
It's a case. It's an or condition of any of them. So
yeah, but that's what I'm saying. It's less than 1 million or whatever. Then 10,000 is less than 1 million. So okay, gotcha. All right, it just kind of flows.
And I can make that as more or less complex if I want to. So that's basically saying to go from here. So a condition on getting from cost center A to approve a cost center A invoice. One of the conditions here, if I look at these conditions, is that the approval group for the invoice is A, so it's in a cost center A invoice, and the user is in the group cost center A, so it's a cost center A approver, and he's an approver, so it's not just associated with cost center A, it's also an approver.
Okay.
And the list of approvers does not contain his name, so in other words, he hasn't already approved the invoice, so he can't approve it twice for example. You might not want that. You might want them to approve it twice. If you were a part of cost center A and B, you might want to be able to do that. And the status is pending approval. So they're all the conditions for those menu items appearing when you click on that workflow menu. So those conditions must be met, these conditions must be met, and then it does these things. And we could have added to here something like send an email, for example. So we could say, when something's approved, let's send an email to someone. And then we just configure here the details of who it's going to go to, etc., and what port it's going to be. And they can be replaced by parameters based on document indexes and so on. So if we knew that cost center A was always going to be approved by a particular person, we could send them an email at the time the invoice is raised. But in my example, I said, well, cost center A could be a group of people, so we won't necessarily know which one. So, I mean, that's it really. It's as simple as that. But obviously, there's a lot more that we could configure, which we haven't shown you, like the auto-populating of indexes or adding of line items. We haven't shown you matching purchase order data or matching goods receipt data. It's really a question of how far you want to go in which direction and what functionality you're particularly looking for. But I think that gives you an overview of what can be done.
Yeah, because like I said, I've got some concerns about the GL coding just because of the nature of our GL accounts.
So what was your concern with GLs?
Well, just we have a long, like I said, it is, I want to say it's 7 segments now. It used to be 2, then they went to 3, and now it's 7.
But is some of that not based on this hierarchy of cost center departments? So you might have 1,000 GL codes, but actually you've only got 300 for Department 1, and then you've actually only got 50 for the combination of Department 1 cost center A. Does it not work like that? So normally the GL code is like 10 digits, the first 3 of a department, the next 3 of the cost center. So there's only actually 4 digits of actual GL code. That's how it normally works.
I'd have to get a list to show you, but I think they are. But I know, like, when you even talk about like what is it, the cost center, right? When you're talking about that, the cost center is like 3 parts, or the department cost center. So again, we just need to look at it and say, okay, this is what the coding is going to be, because ideally that's what we would do, right? Is here is because Greg's the one that's really pushing this. Here's a telephone bill, or here's an internet bill. This is how it gets split up. This is how it's coded. Can we code it and then send it on over to Dynamics to be processed so that it creates, so that somebody's not manually keying it, because hopefully it read the invoice, we've done all the validations, and all we wanted to do is create the invoice because it's already approved and set it for payment in the Dynamics system. Because there shouldn't be a whole lot of extra approvals.
Yeah, so the only time you would want to approve is if it was a non-PO invoice, so it's something that wasn't pre-approved. If it's something you placed an order for and you know that you were expecting an invoice for 100 and you've got an invoice for 100, you shouldn't need to approve it again.
And then, is there a way, like if I get a bill that's normally, let's say it's between 45 and 50,000 every month, and we want to code it the same way, but if it's more than that, then we don't want any of the auto processes to work.
So I would not use an auto. Basically, if you've got the auto coding we call skeletons. If there is one skeleton for an invoice, when the invoice comes in, it will apply the skeleton. If there are 2 skeletons for an invoice, when the invoice is received, it won't get applied. But then when you go to say, oh, let's code this, you can then go to load template and pick from the skeletons. So you have a list of skeletons here, and you say, oh, it's this one, or it's this one, or it's that one.
Am I able to kind of assign skeletons based off a vendor automatically?
Skeletons are vendor specific, yeah.
Okay, good. All right.
And you don't have to use skeletons, because if you've coded an invoice once, you've always got the option to go back and use the same coding as you used on the previous invoice. But if you do that, you can't then automatically prorata the cost across for different lines. So by picking a previously coded, we can copy the cost center departments and GL codes, but we can't fill in the values for each line. But we can with skeletons.
So when is the skeleton applied? When it comes out of OCC coming into DM?
Yeah, when it hits DM from
Okay.
OCC, its initial status is usually empty, it has no status, and then the background service that runs on the server says, right, what have I got that hasn't got a status, and what do I need to do with it? And all of that's configurable, but that's the point at which it says, oh, it's got a purchase order number. Have I got a purchase order that matches that? Have I got any goods receipts that match that? Or if there's no purchase order, are there any skeletons for this? Or, what do I do with it, basically? And that's the point at which the initial status is set. So the whole thing evolves around this sort of diagram of statuses. So you would draw a status map out. I'll get back to my virtual editor. So you'd work out all the possible values of these statuses, like pending approval, pending coding, approved, etc. How they interrelate and what the transition from one state to another is. And then we just implement that. And some of these are implemented in here in this workflow designer, where these are the bits that the users actually click on something, because all of these ones with the red bar here, these represent options on the workflow menu that the users click. Well, there's another part of that that's not diagrammed, that's all the automatic stuff that happens behind the scenes. Like when the fresh invoice comes in, it gets checked against purchase orders and so on.
All right. And then POs, we can set up POs within DM if we have a PO that we want something to match, so that it'll then kind of auto process and go on.
So there's an auto import of there's part of the AP workflow is a data ingestion process, and the data ingestion imports lists of all your supplier details, all your cost centers, all your departments, all your general ledger codes, all your tax codes, plus all your open purchase orders and all your open goods receipts. And so they would normally be maintained in the ERP system, so they'd come from Dynamics in your case. And then if the purchase order on the invoice matches one of your open purchase orders in Dynamics, then it will start comparing the invoice against the purchase order. And there are two ways we can do that. We can do that on a line item basis. So if a PO has got 3 lines on it, and then the invoice will try and match lines on the invoice against lines on the PO. And it's not comparing item codes and descriptions, etc., but it's comparing quantities and unit price and total price per line. So if the PO's got an order for 100 somethings at 23 cents each, and you get an invoice for 100 somethings at 23 cents each from the same supplier, and it's got that purchase order number on, it's going to assume that that is actually a match with that line. The alternative way of doing it is just to look at the invoice totals. So it doesn't care how many lines are on the invoice, and it doesn't care how many lines are on the PO. Quite often, because as you say, you raise the purchase order for 5 items, and you get an invoice that's got 1 line on it, which is all of the 5. Or you do it the other way around. You order 1 thing, and you get an invoice with 5 lines on it because it happened to be made up of 5 parts or something. So in a lot of cases, line item matching doesn't work, in which case we just say, look at the invoice total, and if the total was for 100, and you had a PO for 5 at 20, and actually the PO numbers match, the invoice total matches, then we're good to go. And what we'll do is then copy the line items that are on the purchase order into the invoice and assume that's a match.
It's interesting. I'm wondering, because we have it's not in a purchase order per se, but it kind of is in our accrual process, like on the straight payables, right? We'll go invoice the customer. We'll generate an accrual that says, I expect to pay a freight invoice of $225. Then when I get that freight invoice in, that freight payables, and if it's between 220 and 230, it kind of matches and goes on its merry way, and everybody's happy.
Yeah.
So I don't know if at some point we may want to think about that or not worry about it, because...
So you remember on that where I added the extra line and then tried to click the green tick box and it said no, these don't balance.
Right.
So on that screen, try to get back there. From here, we can add a tolerance percentage. So we can put an absolute amount or a tolerance as a percentage. So we can say if it's within $1 or if it's within 5% or 1% or whatever. So part of the configuration is we can allow a tolerance. It'll still pop up and warn you, but actually it'll let you still click OK if it's within the tolerance.
Okay. But that tolerance is comparing an invoice to a PO, not a tolerance of the line item totals don't match the invoice total.
Well, that's right. It's the tolerance within a percentage of the purchase order. Yeah, you're right. These totals here have to match.
Yeah. Okay.
What are you going to pay? But if these numbers over here, you see there's a GRN total there, there's 0.
Right.
And that is basically saying we haven't received any, we've got no matching PO and receipts for this invoice. But that's okay because this is a non-purchase order invoice. But if this was a purchase order invoice, I wouldn't be able to approve it because there is no matching purchase order.
So in my instance, if we were to figure out a way to send that, and that's not even going to be close to phase 1. I was just trying to think where, because I think we're just going to take those straight payable invoices and send them to our matching process that auto matches in Continuum. But I'm like, well, if I need some information, I get it sooner. And if I have people that are approving and processing by vendor, does it make more sense for them to work from this dashboard than having the other dashboard to try to figure out where they have issues? And I just have to think about that as to which one's more practical. So I'm just looking at ways, and you know me, I'm always thinking of ways that how to use the cool toys to make things better and more efficient.
Yeah.
All right. I think this is good. Like I said, right now my biggest concern is the GL account, and we may be able to build the GL code up enough that it doesn't matter, or the cost center, department center, even though it may be one item, it may be separated by dashes where I may have 2 parts in the cost center, 3 parts in the profit center, and 2 parts in the GL, or whatever I need to build a proper GL for the dynamic system.
Right.
And pretty much it's the same coding every month, unless we do our budget and hardly ever change and add any extra cost centers throughout the year.
So, I mean, all businesses are different, but we've got other businesses using Dynamics, and we've got, in fact, our first ever customer to use this, they're using SAP, and they've got a massive list of GL codes, but you know, in most cases, they don't worry about it because the GL codes are not manually coded. They're picked automatically because they're matched for the purchase order, and the purchase orders are GL coded. So, you know, it's not like you have to come and click this list to code.
Yeah, no. I would think that most of the invoices that Greg and Carrie and them are talking about doing are predefined skeleton GL codes or whatever. Even if it's not a PO, it'd be in the skeleton and how to break it down in percentages. And it just matters how we need to store it, right? Because it's got to be stored in here, and then it's got to be exported. And I'm assuming we can export any combination of things as needed out of this table.
Yeah, any data that you need, any data that we've got, obviously we can put in pretty much any format that we want.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's good. I think, Dan, next steps, probably go ahead and send this to Carrie. Go ahead and send me a copy of the recording, too, just in case Greg, and it wouldn't hurt to even copy Greg in case he wants to look at it.
Sure. Perfect. Okay. Sounds good. Awesome. All right, well, thanks for your time, Ralph. Thank you, Tim. I'll get that over here hopefully later this morning or early afternoon.
You're welcome.